Oh, okay, here we are. Welcome to Science on Tap Minocqua. Thank you for coming. My name is Carol Warden. I work up at UW Trout Lake Station. Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea that was conceived in 1905, that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. Our partners in Science on Tap include Rocky Reef Brewing, woo! Lakeland chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, UW Trout Lake Station, Minocqua Public Library, and WXPR Radio. Science on Tap is supported through a grant from the Brittingham Fund to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You have 3 ways to watch. Join us right here in person, as you all are. Thank you. You can watch live on YouTube. When you watch on YouTube, you can ask any question in the comment box, and it will get relayed back to us here. And there's a link for this YouTube channel on our scienceontapminocqua.org website as well. You can also watch events later. So we record all these, and we archive them, so you can go to our website and check it out if you have missed one in the past. Our next event will be on Thursday, May 2nd, and we'll hear from Rocky Reef's very own Christy and Tyler Smith. Woo! And they'll be sharing their knowledge on the brewing process, and I'm hopeful that there will be some good stories too. I also wanted to remind everybody that UW-Madison's Day of the Badger, this is a day of giving, is coming up with 1,848 minutes of giving, beginning on April 16th at 10:12 a.m. and ending April 17th at 5 p.m. You can support your academic and alumni programs, for example, Center for Limnology, Trout Lake Station, CALS, Kemp Station, and the Lakeland chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association through their scholarship fund. So you can tune in for that and for matches and challenges. That's the Day of the Badger, April 16th and 17th. All right, tonight we have Dr. Holly Embke, and she is discussing how some of our favorite Midwest fishes are adapting to climate change. Dr. Embke is a research fish biologist with U.S. Geological Survey's Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Her research aims to support self-sustaining inland fish communities in a changing climate across a range of scales. Her work is collaborative, and it informs the conservation of inland fishes by working directly with partners to address areas of concern and to develop adaptation strategies. Dr. Embke grew up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. She received her doctorate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and currently lives in Minneapolis. And during her PhD, Holly spent 5 summers doing research right here out of Trout Lake Station. And she fostered a very deep connection with the Northwoods through that time. So we're glad to have her back today. Per tradition, we have a little trivia story about Holly. So during those 5 years that she spent in the Northwoods, Dr. Embke helped lead a warm water fish removal experiment. And this was to see if it was possible to open up a window for walleye to increase in numbers. Her team worked summer after summer, removing fish that were thought to compete with walleye for food or habitat. These included all sizes of fish, big and small. So how many fish do you think were removed during this experiment? A, 300,000, B, 1 million, or C, 1,000? A, 300,000, 1 million, or 1,000? 300,000. Centrarchidae, right? Maybe she'll talk a little bit about that more. Holly Embke.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Carol, for that warm introduction. As Carol mentioned, my name is Holly. I am a research fish biologist with the USGS Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And so most of what my work is and what I'll be talking about today is the importance of freshwater fisheries and how climate change is likely to affect those fisheries, as well as the ways that we're already thinking about supporting those fisheries and to adapt to that change. So to kind of start off, I imagine, at least from my experience from working up here and being a Wisconsin native and all of that stuff, how many of you here fish yourselves? Okay, incredible, incredible. How many of you fish for walleye? Okay. How many of you fish for bluegill? Cool. Okay, so lots on both sides, it seems. So you're going to hear me talking about cool water fishes throughout this little spiel tonight. Walleye, perfect example of a cool water fish. Bluegill, perfect example of a warm water fish. So just keep that in mind as we're moving forward. So for a little bit of background and to kind of provide context, inland fisheries, these freshwater fisheries of the upper Midwest like we have here, as well as around the globe, are super, super important. I don't need to necessarily tell that to a room full of folks who really enjoy fishing themselves, but if you think about the value that you gain from fishing, it may come in the form of an experience of culture where you really connect to the experience of fishing and being out on the water, and sharing time with family and friends. It may come from the food you gain from harvesting those fish. It may come from the economic support, from the support of folks traveling in to buy things at your bait shop. Whatever it looks like, fisheries are really important for a lot of different reasons, whether that's culture, food, money, lots of different ways. But many factors, like climate change, are affecting the way that inland fisheries are able to support themselves. So specifically in the Midwest, some of our favorite fisheries, like walleye, are struggling given this climate change. So to take a step back for a second, what do we kind of expect to happen in the upper Midwest up here in given climate change, and what are we kind of already starting to see? So how many folks here think that we should probably have had a pretty different kind of winter than we did? I personally, as an avid cross-country skier, would have enjoyed quite a bit more snow, but that was not the case. And so what we're planning, or what we're thinking and anticipating with climate change, are much more winters like the one we just experienced, where we're planning for warmer temperatures, shorter winters with less snow and ice, and then more precipitation in the form of rainfall and that. And overall, just more extremes, exactly like we saw with this winter. So we also know that this year was an El Nino year, and so it was meant to be warmer for a variety of other ways. But climate change really exacerbates these other things going on, like natural weather fluctuations and land use change and other drivers at play. So you've got change happening, and then you've got climate change effects on top of that, just really exacerbate the effects overall. So the combination of warmer temperatures, shorter winters, more precipitation, and more variability are all really likely to influence the important inland fisheries, especially in the region like this that has lots and lots of lakes and rivers. So one thing that so for all of those folks out here who said that they fish themselves, have you noticed any changes in walleye? Raise your hand if you have noticed any changes in walleye over the last 10 to 15 years. Okay, got a couple people. Can you raise your hand if you think that change, walleye have gone down? Okay, so we've got some trends where we're seeing and experiencing walleye going down, which is exactly the trend that we're seeing broadly, where cool water fishes like walleye, like lake sturgeon, like in some places yellow perch, are declining in abundance, and cold water fishes as well, like lake whitefish and cisco, are declining, while at the same time, warm water species like bluegill and largemouth bass are increasing in abundance. And that's largely thought to be because of these large-scale climate drivers, where warming lake temperatures are really shifting the availability of habitat away from cool water species like walleye towards the preference for supporting warm water species like bluegill. But we also know that there's tons and tons of lakes and rivers across, especially a landscape like this, that are not going to respond to large-scale drivers like climate change all in the same way. And so in certain places, populations are declining and not doing super well. And in other places, walleye are doing quite well and are stable in their populations. And so we know climate change broadly is going to have effects in putting additional pressures on cool and cold water fishes while opening windows for warm water species. But that effect is going to be highly variable across all of these lakes and rivers. And so my work is basically to figure out what can we do to support these fisheries, knowing that they're going to be changing in the future and that they're already changing. So one way that we can think about adapting to this change is we can resist that change and we can try to maintain our historical populations in the way that they once were. So I think a perfect example of this type of approach and thinking is kind of right out of our window here and is associated with the Minocqua chain. So are folks here familiar at all with the walleye rehabilitation or any of the walleye work that has been happening for the past few years on the Minocqua chain? Yeah, so you may be familiar where you haven't been able to harvest walleye out of the Minocqua chain for the past few years. While harvest has been stopped, folks have been stocking fish, and they've also been putting in some efforts to restore habitat, and specifically spawning habitat, all within the aim to not only restore and boost adult numbers, but also boost baby walleye and recruitment. So, so far, basically what we've seen with that restoration effort is that adult numbers have gone up, but recruitment, so the kind of reproduction and rejuvenation of the population, hasn't increased over time, despite all of these efforts, despite no harvest and additional stocking and habitat restoration. We haven't been able to restart the reproduction and recruitment side of the population. And so that work is still in progress, and it's promising that adult numbers are increasing, and so there may be time lags associated with that, and we're keeping an eye on it to see if we can see some recruitment pop up in the future. But overall, we just really are starting to see that it's really challenging to resist this change in certain populations and try to maintain the historical levels of cool and cold water fishes in places that they once were really, really abundant. And so habitat and other changes like increasing warm water fishes like bass and sunfishes, which may be causing increased predation and competition pressure on cool water species, may become more limiting as the climate changes and these factors kind of compound on one another. And so we may need to start thinking about how best to prioritize our efforts, because not all populations are going to not all historical, let's say, walleye populations or cool water populations are going to be successful into the future, but some certainly will. And we're already seeing through what's called a bright spots approach, where we're trying to identify populations that are doing better than they once, than they kind of should be, given all this climate change, to work to conserve and direct our efforts to those areas. And then think about other areas where we may have historically put a lot of effort into supporting cool and cold water fisheries, and maybe let those, but those that may not be successful into the future, and think about letting those shift towards warm water species or other cool water species that are potentially going to do better with climate change, such as yellow perch. So this is all just a kind of brief intro to start thinking about the fact that these inland fisheries around us that it seems like everyone here is really invested in and personally engages with. And we know they're really important, we know they're changing, but that there's lots of things we can do to adapt to this change. And we're, to figure out the best ways to do that, it's important to think about developing solutions with folks such as yourselves in the room to figure out what will be the most feasible and best solution into the future. So it's not a doom and gloom picture given climate change. There's lots we can do to adapt to this change. The future just may not look the same way that it once did. So I think with that, I will open it up for questions. Yeah? Okay.
So, per the usual, Amber will be walking around with the mic, so wait for her to get to you so we can all hear you in the room and so the online audience can hear you. So bring that mic right up close when she brings it around.
Yeah. There's one up here, Amber.
Okay. Up here, a lot of people tend to focus on adult fishery populations. And the bottom line is, with climate change, what we're seeing is really a change in the bottom trophic levels, the zooplankton and the algae. Like on the Minocqua chain, is somebody actually studying that and quantifying that? Because we know that the timing of spawning with, the warm up and everything else is absolutely critical in those zooplankton populations that feed those fry.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this question was asking about kind of the connection between lower trophic levels like zooplankton and algae that really form the foundation of the food web to support those higher trophic levels like adult walleye. So if you can imagine, and really form the foundational component for baby walleye to then grow into adult walleye or adult fishes. Absolutely, we anticipate changes given climate change to adversely, kind of in similar ways, to adversely impact zooplankton and algae, but again, in highly variable ways across populations. Folks are absolutely looking into that, and there's specific work underway right now thinking about especially those winter dynamics and how that may affect the timing of ice out as it relates to then algae, spring algal blooms, zooplankton hatching, and then subsequent larval fish and juvenile reproduction and recruitment. So I think we're starting to dive into that and kind of get into those analyses, but it's all in process at this point, yeah. But those food web connections and understanding that, and I think that's a really key point, that with climate change, not only will it affect the adult fish population or one portion of a food web, it has the potential to cascade to lots of different parts of a food web and have some interesting interactions throughout. And some parts of a food web may be more resilient to change while other parts of a food web may not. Yeah.
Holly, I know I'm familiar with your research and what you did, but I guess as an undergrad, you also did paleolimnology.
I did, yes.
Okay. Did you apply that to you understanding your control lake and your other lake in consideration of, I guess, the habitat and the ecology of what's going on? I guess that's my minor question, but my bigger question is, now that you work for the USGS, and I'm following up a lot of the research on walleye, and this is what I'm running into, that I think the USGS has apparently a better budget, and all the data that's going in, okay, to any studies on lakes is going into a big bank, right? A big data bank. Okay, how soon do you feel, and because answering this question that we have, how soon do you feel that we'll have enough information that we can bring it all together. And maybe I'm suggesting AI. Okay, what good is taking all this information and getting all this research without turning the crank and make some practicality out of it? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the question was kind of focused around, in my opinion, basically taking research and turning it into actionable solutions and turning it into potentially informing management decision making and potentially policy, to shift levers and shift decision making around how regulations and decisions are made that have the power to control basically the levers that are under the control of humans. And I will say that tons of research has been done historically that has informed management decision making, and I do think we're at a stage now, like you said, that it is really important to take the research and turn it into those actionable solutions. And that's the kind of entire motivation for the program that I work for now, is basically transforming research and doing research that is specifically aimed at providing those actionable solutions. So when I talk about a potential bright spots approach where we're working with both state, federal, and tribal partners to prioritize which walleye populations may be the most resilient to future change, to then be able to direct efforts towards those areas, while also then acknowledging which areas we may want to shift management efforts, walleye management efforts away for, or start thinking about things differently. That's all in collaboration with managers in an effort to directly inform policy and decision making.
Hi, I'm super curious as to these bright spots. Is it the population? Is it something in the genetics? Is it the location? Or is it just this like perfect three little bears, just right spot? And is that something that is measurable and patterns to it?
That's a great question, and I am going to probably give you an unsatisfying answer and say it depends. It completely depends, and it depends who you're talking to, and it depends because I think what one person considers as a really successful good walleye population is really different from another person. And so a lot of the work that we're doing now is trying to understand basically overlaps between what you're talking about. I think like genetics is one factor that people really care about in some contexts. Adult population size is something someone else really cares about. Other folks may really care about things that are harder to measure, like how far away a given walleye population is from their home or something like that. And so trying to overlay all of these important values that people hold associated with inland fisheries to then let others decide, basically provide that information and let others decide, okay, for me, this is a really bright fishery, and therefore I want to, and provide a menu of options that would then be suitable for supporting that population.
We have an online comment from one of our viewers. Whirling disease in Wisconsin, is that something you could comment on?
I will probably have to pass on that, and I will have to say that's probably outside of the scope of my expertise.
Well, we have another online question in that case. In the short term, how do you predict our past winter's weather will affect summer fishing next year?
Oh, this year? So of this past winter, given it was a really warm and highly variable spring, it's super hard to say. I mean, we were just talking over dinner about how strange it was that we had full ice out and then lakes refroze. And given that ice out is a very sensitive trigger for many fish species to initiate spawning and initiate lots of factors, I think it won't. That has the potential to really to influence, I would say, future populations and future recruitment dynamics. I don't necessarily know if those effects will take place this year, and we would see those effects, especially in adult populations, this summer or anything like that. But I think the effects may have a bit of a lag to catch up as earlier life stages and spawning and recruitment may be more affected.
Culturally, when did the USGS migrate from a couple hundred million? When did the USGS migrate from a couple hundred million years of which is what they do? You said paleo. You know, they're not interested in billions of years ago, and now you're interested in next year's fishing season. That doesn't seem like something the USGS would really be interested in, and why USGS instead of the DNR or U.S. Forest Service or someone else?
Yeah, it's a great question. So USGS is a massive federal agency, federal agency within Department of Interior. I will say, so I work for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is part of a 9 regions within our kind of network of other climate adaptation science centers. And so we're very small, we're relatively new. We were established about a decade ago, and the establishment of the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, and the Midwest has been the most recent one. So the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center was just established about 3 years ago. We were established with the intention to deal with climate change and provide actionable solutions for dealing with climate change, and to basically bridge research, and whether that research comes from state management agencies, federal researchers, or academic scientists, or anyone else, with management decision making, and to really form that bridge. And so that is where I sit within USGS. There are tons of other folks within USGS who do everything from create maps of the entire world and figure out when volcanoes are going to erupt and all of that type of thing. And ban birds, exactly. My center is very much focused on building this bridge between research and decision making.
I was just curious with regard to latitude analysis, and if I'm sure you have counterparts, and I'm not sure whether you work with people in other countries. I mean, are we seeing kind of a creeping of this, or is there a latitude where we feel that this may stop, or what's the research on that?
Yeah, it's a great question around kind of latitudinal shifts and how that relates to broader climate change effects. So it is high. So climate change effects broadly are nowhere is immune. We'll say that climate change effects are happening globally, but those effects are very region specific. And so for the Midwest here, when I talk about warming temperatures and increasing precipitation, shorter winters, more variability, that's very specific to the Midwest. But there's other places throughout the U.S. that are also, I would say the warming temperatures is universal to the world. And so a lot of the latitudinal work that people in the climate change world do like to apply is thinking about maybe proxies, especially for fish perspectives. If we have let's say a bluegill population in the southern part of the US, is that going to be representative of what Wisconsin's bluegill populations look like in 50 to 70 years? And can we have lessons learned basically from an understanding of what more southerly fish populations look like, because that is what our climate will look like in the future. That is absolutely informative and helpful in one way. It doesn't necessarily consider all the other regional climate drivers that also are at play beyond temperature, basically. So there's a lot of interactions in climate change effects beyond temperature, which is kind of the universal factor at play.
Well, that's a nice segue. I'm glad you brought that up, that climate change is just one of the influences on all of these different systems, the lakes and stuff. And how do you tease out the, and kind of rank what is the most important, what factor is the most influential in a particular, system, like land use around a particular waterway or recreational activities. I see that with more high-speed boats and those jet pack boat, I don't know what you even call those things, that are disrupting the thermal, cline of the lakes. That, water use and land use around them have huge impacts on nutrient cycling, as the gentleman pointed out earlier, the importance of that stratification of these lakes. So how do you, and I'm assuming other people within USGS or at the DNR and other places are doing this study as well, but is there a way to, within specific lakes, what influences are the most, having the most influence? I guess that's my question. But also, for those populations of walleye, how much effort is going into restocking? And if you're just letting nature take its course, how many populations of walleye are just genetically bottlenecked that they are not large enough populations anyway?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I will try to remember that, but I may have to ask you for the second one in a second. So, for your first question about kind of understanding the importance of different factors influencing a given water body. So, yeah, in addition to climate change, you've got lots of other things happening. You've got land use change, whether that's like housing development or agricultural development in a watershed, forestry, all types of different things that can affect what ends up in a lake and then how that cycles through and ends up in our fish populations. And then that's only one factor in addition to climate change. I will say it is going to depend on your specific setting that you're thinking about. But what gets really important for the context of my work and the folks, decision makers, is really thinking about which factors are within their control and which factors are not within their control. So climate change is a factor that is changing things, but is outside of the control of local managers. Whereas something like land use change is also driving change, but is within the control of local managers. And so it doesn't necessarily, it's almost impossible to disentangle the relative impact of, let's say, climate change versus land use on a fish population. That's very, very challenging. But we know they're both having an effect. Climate change, we can't really do anything about locally. Land use, we can. So if we're going to try to conserve our fish or water bodies or whatever we're doing, our only real lever in that equation is to change our land use practices, basically. So I guess given our lack of available knowledge, or we're never going to be able to say it was climate change, it was land use, it was harvest, it was one thing. But we know what are the things that we can control and what are the things we can't control. And that kind of starts at least our conversation around the possible actions we can take to then adapt and conserve. Oh, sorry. And then walleye stocking question that was about how kind of prevalent walleye stocking is. Yeah, so walleye stocking is highly prevalent, especially in the ceded territory, northern third portion of the state, as well as the southern portion. Many of the walleye populations in the southern portion of Wisconsin are supported completely off of stocking, and then in the northern portion, there are many naturally recruiting populations or naturally reproducing populations, but there are many that are increasingly supported by supplemental stocking, and then there are many populations that are supported solely through stocking. And so when I talk about potentially shifting management efforts away from populations, walleye management efforts away from populations that may not do super well in the future. I'm not necessarily talking about those that are naturally reproducing and super wonderful. I'm thinking about potentially those populations that are completely supported by stocking and not able to naturally reproduce on their own, that type of thing, because stocking is very prevalent.
That pretty much was exactly my question. Up until about 20 years ago, Wisconsin, in the northern third of the state, was a put and take walleye fishery. And we've basically abandoned that about 20 years ago. And I've noticed the shift for walleyes. They're basically to the oligotrophic lakes. The early meso and mid-meso lakes don't support walleyes at all anymore, at least in natural reproduction. So how do you sift that out of your data going forward?
Yeah, that's exactly the type of information and data that we are using to understand what would contribute to a bright walleye population, bright spot walleye population, basically. So if lake characteristics, especially like trophic status, like oligotrophic versus mesotrophic versus eutrophic, and we're starting to see a trend, that's the exact analysis that we're kind of in the process of doing and considering now to then relate trophic status to all of these different factors like adult abundance and recruitment status and the kind of considerations that people have for a bright fishery. So, and that comes out as well in the data that walleye are pretty specific in their habitat preferences. And yes, sorry. So recruitment, for those that are not aware, so recruitment is basically when a baby fish turns into a teenager. Yes, thank you. I'm like, it's actually kind of difficult to say that. Yeah, so when a baby fish turns into a teenager and a teenager is like old enough to survive, we consider a recruited fish to like be good enough to live to, we think it's going to be an adult one day, basically. So there's a difference. So especially with some fish that we're seeing, especially like with climate change, like we're documenting this now with walleye and lake sturgeon, what's called like a juvenile bottleneck, where fish are reproducing, they're depositing eggs and reproducing like normal. But then when we go sample and try to measure for recruitment to see if they make it to that teenager stage, they're not making it to that teenager stage. And so they're not making it from the baby stage to the teenager stage. So something is happening in the middle there to really create a bottleneck around those really early life stages.
I've got an online question here. So today, the DNR and WPR reported that, I'm going to try and say this correctly, Myoxobolus cerebralis was found in a fish farm that diverted 100% of a creek in northern Wisconsin into their operations. Will this spread to walleye, do you think?
I will have to say that is also beyond my expertise. I do not know that specifically, but I would have to look into it.
You were mentioning earlier that you love to receive feedback from public. So is there any opportunities for just citizens like me to log on something like iNaturalist? And I know fisherman never tells, but if you could put in a certain vicinity instead of the lake, it might help your research. Is that something in the works, or is there something already available to us to do?
That is not available, but it's in the works. And so I will catch up with you after this because it's fully in development right now. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. So yes, thank you. That would be fantastic. The hope is to try to gather the information around folks' values associated. This is kind of going down the rabbit hole of a specific project, but try to understand the values associated with that people have with specific types of fisheries to then incorporate that into our decision making.
Hi, I apologize, you might have already said this, but I was trying to ask if what consideration you take for Lake Superior versus the smaller inland lakes? And is there more funding there? Is it doing better because of its size? Is size a huge factor in your research?
Yeah, so size is a huge factor in kind of how lakes are affected by everything, and certainly climate change. I will say, so at least within my USGS world. So our work at the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center predominantly focuses on inland systems, so those non-Great Lakes systems, although I do some work especially focused, I mean, fish go everywhere, as we know. They swim through rivers that then touch Great Lakes and so on. But I don't do, there's an entire science center in USGS devoted to Great Lakes research and science. And so I collaborate with them to think about overlap, but predominantly my work is on inland systems. Lake Superior is affected by these kind of same factors that I mentioned, the warming temperatures, shorter winters, more precipitation, and these extremes, but given its size in a very different way. So compared to these small inland systems. And so we kind of have, and especially Lake Superior, even relative to other Great Lakes, because of its size and its depth, is projected to experience climate change in a pretty specific way, to affect potentially its mixing and the ice cover and a shoreline area. Yeah.
How about our really cold water fish? Are we going to lose our lake trout and Cisco?
Yeah, so cold water fish, lake trout, Cisco, lake whitefish are already pretty limited when it comes to their distribution in these small inland systems, and even in the Great Lakes where they're more abundant, they are definitely experiencing declines. But in the same way that when we think about cool water fish, there will certainly be its habitat is the most limiting thing for these cold water species. And so in certain areas, there will be refuge habitat available, and folks are doing a lot, especially over kind of in the Minnesota side of things. Some work has been done that's been really quite promising to think about potential like watershed habitat restoration and management to limit land use change and runoff, to protect the cool water habitat and oxygenated habitat in those deep water lakes, to protect for cold water species. And so we're thinking about ways to support cold water species like lake trout and Cisco and lake whitefish, and habitat is really the key thing there.
Hi. You have perhaps 100 years of weather data from around here, but you also have perhaps 100 years of fishing licenses, history of fish finders, barbed hooks, number of registered fishing boats on the lakes, number of fishermen, anecdotal information. Does that overlay to the weather? And I would think that might be more significant than even the weather. Or since we had the record snowfall last winter, anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think exactly what you're getting at is weather can be highly variable over time, and how does that trickle into or affect these fish population time series or angling license time series and things like that. It gets a little tricky when you start to think about social dynamics like angling fish or fishing sales and stuff like that, because there's a lot of in-betweens of what affects what. But we have looked at least species specific in the state of Wisconsin, trends in fishing catch and fishing harvest over time, and then related that to climatic changes. And it tracks, as you would expect, where, and also related that to fishing abundance. So in places where we see we kind of regionally are seeing these increasing water temperatures, we're also seeing increasing warm water species abundance, and then decreasing cool water and cold water species abundance, while at the same time, fishers are catching and keeping more warm water species, while they're not catching and they're not keeping as many cool water species. That's broad. When you break it down into species-specific stuff, it gets a little bit more variable, but broadly, the trends do track between fish populations and the climatic changes.
I was really talking about technology.
Oh.
How it's affected fishing.
Oh, okay.
Whether it's technology, man-made technology versus climate change. And there's a lot of man-made technology that's changed in the last 100 years, which affects populations also.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, thinking about so the question was about how technology has affected potentially fishing practices and how fishing practice. Sorry.
Fishing practices and pollution,
Okay. Yes.
not just the climate.
Yeah. Are you talking about fishing technology?
I'm talking about barb hooks.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Absolutely, people are getting better at fishing and harvesting than they once were. How that relates to climate changes, I guess, is challenging to disentangle probably, because I think people are targeting different species over time. And so, yeah, I think people have definitely gotten better at fishing given the technological changes in effect.
I've got an online question here. What's the latest on lake sturgeon as it relates to climate change? And great talk.
Okay, yeah, yes. So lake sturgeon are another cool water species. They have this similar thermal tolerance to walleye, but much, much longer lived. So lake sturgeon can live for over 100 years and grow to in excess of 6 feet and travel for over 100 river kilometers to make their spring migrations for spawning. So lake sturgeon have a kind of historical or a history of experiencing mass declines where due to significant overharvest and habitat fragmentation predominantly through the building of dams, the historical abundance of lake sturgeon declined over 90% in the Great Lakes region. So since about the 1950s, when practices changed, lake sturgeon populations have remained relatively stable, but there's increasing concern that lake sturgeon will be affected adversely from climate change, and we're already starting to see that. And so a bunch of work we're doing is really trying to focus on lake sturgeon and understand those changes. And the key concerns with lake sturgeon and climate change really focus on the impacts on their spring spawning, where lake sturgeon move from deep rivers and deep lakes where they grow and feed all year, and then they move into these fast-flowing river areas when river flows start to increase and water temperatures drop, associated with increased runoff from spring flows and ice off. And so with climate change, when we see earlier ice off, warming temperatures, increased precipitation, all kind of combining to lead to earlier runoff and heavier runoff periods, there's a lot of concern that especially fish like lake sturgeon that make these long migrations will have a mismatch in when they make their spawning runs up to their spawning grounds, whether they'll be able to access their spawning habitats, and whether their spawning habitat will be suitable. And so with that in mind, we're doing a lot of work to figure out what the best adaptation options are for different areas. And a lot of that comes down to, I think, what you've probably heard me say a lot is habitat restoration, habitat protection, restoring connectivity between areas that potentially were disconnected through dams or other types of infrastructure. So yeah, lake sturgeon, another cool water fish that people don't necessarily always think about as sensitive to climate change, but are.
Yeah, in consideration with climate change, I'm wondering if you had any specific data on what happens with the oxidation in the smaller lakes, considering that's for some of the species is a huge factor.
Absolutely. So that is, I think, becoming increasingly important in our understanding of the effects of climate change is that what's some people call this thermal oxy squeeze, where oxygenated habitat is really reduced, especially in times like the summer when it's really warm. And so available habitat for fish is actually really reduced and much smaller than what we may think it is, because there's no oxygen basically at the bottom of the lake. In the summer, or in other periods, can happen in other periods of time. And so not only is warmer water temperatures and these climatic effects directly impacting fish species, but then they're interacting with other kind of physical dynamics of water to result in low oxygen conditions to further squeeze populations. And so in addition to when we think about kind of suitable habitat for fish now and into the future, we don't want to just think about temperature. We also want to think about oxygen, and we also want to think about some other factors as well. Mm-hmm.
You were talking about, habitat restoration. When it comes down to brass tacks, who pays for that and who initiates that? Because climate change can be a touchy subject with the folks that may approve or deny that type of work.
Absolutely. Yeah, it depends, I will say, depending on your context. But there is a good amount of federal support, I will say, from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or some of the Great Lakes agencies and trusts and fishery commissions to really, really push for habitat restoration and initiatives. And so there are certain kind of lines of funding that are devoted exclusively towards habitat restoration, especially on the federal level. Mm-hmm.
I've got another online question here. Last year's drought combined with lack of spring runoff have receded shorelines and warmer water. Can fisheries rebound?
Yeah, so hard to say off of a single year. Fish populations are super variable. And so one bad year for a fish population isn't necessarily going to sink the entire population forever. It's this continual variability that becomes really challenging over time. And so it's one of those things where we have to kind of watch it play out over a period of time and do what we can to reduce that variability. So potentially next year, if there is a big drought, then water levels don't recede as much, type of thing. And so we know fish populations naturally are quite variable, and that's not unexpected, but it is reducing how often that variability happens over time that we want to avoid.
I've got one more online question here then. There's a perception that walleye are doing better in Minnesota than here in northern Wisconsin. Is that actually the case, and why?
I don't think that is, I will say that is not the case. I can tell you right now that's not the case. Minnesota has a really different landscape than northern Wisconsin. Northern Wisconsin is like lots and lots of tiny lakes. Relative to Minnesota. Minnesota has also lots of tiny lakes, but also a few select very, very, very large lakes that are relative to small lakes, very productive for walleye. And so it's a little bit of an apples and oranges situation. Also, the management approaches across Wisconsin and Minnesota are quite different, especially when we start to think about things like stocking. So in Minnesota, stocking practices are also very intensive, and so populations are heavily supported through stocking in certain areas.
Well, join me in thanking Dr. Holly Embke for the talk. Thanks to everybody who participated, and thanks to our sponsors, the Lakeland chapter of the UW Alumni Association, Rocky Reef, Trout Lake Station, Kemp Station, WXPR Radio, and the Brittingham Fund. And we hope to see you back here in May, where we'll hear about brewing beer. And if you want to sign up for our email reminders, we have a sign-up sheet in the back. And don't forget to also visit us on our website for any archived, or you can sign up for our email there. And also a quick reminder of Day of the Badger, April 16th and 17th, Day of Giving. Thank you for coming.